All right, so this will be a review of Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 1, Section 1, the Americas. So being the very beginning of the text, one of the questions is, well, when do you begin with United States history? And here we're going to begin with the first Americans. That is to say, the first people who arrived to North and South America. And those people arrived via Beringia, or the Bering Land Bridge. That is, migrations across a certain geographic area. Now, if we were to take this map here of North and South America and extend it northward a little bit, we would recognize that Alaska is somewhere up here. Now, roughly speaking, in the year, we'll say 12,000 BCE, there was a global event known as the Ice Age. And what had occurred during the Ice Age was that because global temperatures were much cooler, a lot more water was frozen in the form of ice, meaning that sea levels overall were much, much less. And during that time, during the Ice Age, because sea levels were much, much less, you could actually walk across this particular area. So you have Asia on this side, or Siberia. You have North America on this side. And because water levels were much lower, there was essentially a land bridge. And this is the geographic area we refer to as Beringia. And so those people simply migrated and walked across this area, roughly 10,000 years ago. However, the Ice Age ended after a couple of thousand years. And so this area, which had previously been land, let's see if I can do this, now essentially became submerged underwater. And so the people who had migrated to North and South America, in other words, the first Americans, for the next 10,000 years became isolated from their counterparts in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And we use these terms to describe these different geographic landmasses. So we'll use the term New World to describe North and South America. Essentially what you're looking at right here, North and South America. We use the term Old World to describe Europe, Asia, and Africa, right? And that essentially is the unillustrated part of the world here. So Old World and New World, from the ending of the Ice Age all the way until 1492, were isolated from one another, developed different cultures, different societies, different languages, different religions, different biology, different plants, different animals developed on both sides of the globe. Now, for the people who arrived in the Americas, right, these first Americans, they originated, or most of them, were hunting and gathering societies, which meant that they had to move rather frequently. Around the time of the Ice Age, in fact, all human societies were hunting and gathering. But roughly around the year, and it depends exactly on where geographically we're speaking, but we'll say roughly around the year 8000 BCE, you have the development of domesticated plants and domesticated animals. And what that essentially led to was the creation of permanent societies. When societies no longer have to move or gather their food, they can essentially grow their food in terms of agriculture, they can domesticate animals, and what that allows for is the development of civilization. In this case, both civilizations, or people in the Old World and people in the New World, developed agricultural societies or permanent civilization. So that certainly was a feature when these two worlds essentially collide with one another in the year 1492. So we have New World, we have Old World, we have farming occurring on both sides of the globe. Now, let's get into a little bit more detail. Actually, before we do that, let me go ahead and just clear up a little bit something in regards to the dating system, because I know that some of us may have not been exposed to this before, but in terms of dates, if you have not come across this term before, BCE, it essentially means before Common Era. And so if I draw a timeline here, right, today is the year 2020, 2020 CE. We refer to that as Common Era. You have essentially year 0. Anything since that time is considered CE, Common Era. So 2020 CE means it's been 2020 years since year 0 or year 1, however you want to explain it. BCE is this way, right? BCE. So when referring to the year 8000 BCE, essentially 8,000 years would have to pass until you get to year 0. Then you add on another 2020 years. So we would say 8,000 BCE was roughly 10,000 years ago. So that's, if you haven't been exposed to that before, that should help you sort of visualize what this means. Common Era. Before Common Era, this was created by Christian civilizations. Year 0 is essentially the time when Jesus Christ was alive. So moving on. So what about these first Americans? Well, we know that they had permanent settlements. They had advanced civilizations. Let's talk about some of these civilizations in particular. So the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, and maybe I'll use a different color here for a second, was located in Mesoamerica, which is modern-day Mexico. Mesoamerica, of course, means Middle America. And the earliest of these civilizations were the Olmec. Now, all of these civilizations in Mesoamerica or Middle America share similar cultural characteristics. That is to say, they pass on sort of a similar way of life through the years. The Olmecs, who essentially were the founders, so to speak, pioneered, you could say, many of these cultural characteristics, but some of them perhaps even predate the Olmec civilization. So what can we say about Mesoamerican society? That is the society of people or the civilization that existed in Mesoamerica, modern-day Mexico. For the most part, when we think about religion, Mesoamerican religion was polytheistic. That is the belief in many gods or goddesses, a lot of times with a focus on the natural world. Religiously, there was the practice of ritual bloodletting or sacrifice. Bloodletting is where priests, or sometimes non-priests, cut themselves as a sacrifice to the gods. This, of course, was not just characteristic, or all of these are not just characteristic of Olmec society, but in fact, all Mesoamerican societies. The food that provides sort of the foundation for that society was corn or maize. Because there was enough food being produced in Mesoamerican societies, you had a division of labor. This is true of all civilizations, essentially true of all sedentary societies, which led to people who could specialize in the creation of things like mathematics, the creation of a calendar system, which is very closely tied to agriculture. In fact, the very first calendars that are created are found exclusively in agricultural societies and are helpful because they not necessarily predict, but they sort of allow people to know when certain harvests are going to come, right? When do you harvest? When do you plant? And those are essentially why the calendar system is very important. Mesoamerican society also developed their own written language. This is a very rare human invention, but it did exist in Mesoamerica. And in terms of tools and weapons, obsidian, which is a black glass-like rock. For the civilizations of the New World, Mesoamerican and elsewhere, there is no hard metal technology. That is to say, things like iron, steel, etc., but you do have very sharp stone weapons, stone tools, and those were certainly utilized. Now, the Olmec civilization in particular, so all of these things, essentially the technology, the knowledge, writing systems, these are passed down throughout the years, but the Olmecs themselves were at their height from 12,000 BCE to 4,000 BCE. That's really when the Olmec civilization thrived. And they're most well known for these giant head structures, which they created. And generally speaking, when we look at various civilizations around the world, one indicator or marker of their wealth and power are the structures they build, because that tells us a little bit about the resources, how many resources are there, but really the ability to accumulate them. So Olmec Society, most well known for their giant heads, and the Olmecs were the predecessors to later advanced Mesoamerican civilizations. The next are the Maya. The Maya come a little bit later, so if we're thinking about this in terms of a timeline, right, we've got 12,000 BCE to roughly 400 BCE. It was during this time that the Olmec thrived, year 0. The Maya aren't until right here, right? So this is long after Olmec civilization, but many of these traditions, technologies, culture kept alive and inherited by the Maya, who only built upon them even more. And the Maya were perhaps most known for architecture and mathematics, also the calendar system. You may have heard of the Mayan calendar before, but really in terms of pyramid and temple building is where the Maya certainly thrived the most. Perhaps the most impressive feature of Mayan society is both the pyramid of the sun and the moon, but especially Chichen Itza, which you have pictured here. And this was a temple in which the Mayan built. These pyramid-like structures are very, very sturdy, right? They can certainly stand the test of time. And because the Maya were equipped with a written language that they inherited, they created codex. And a codex is a written source. This could be either religious, this could be historical, right? And one of the useful things about these codex is that it provides us with a unique insight into Mayan society at that particular time. One problem for us today, historically speaking, is that when the Spanish arrived in 1492, they in fact destroyed many of the Maya codex because they weren't Christian, and for that reason they needed to be destroyed. So we don't have as much of these written sources from Mayan society as we do perhaps other sources because of the actions of the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish priests who had later came. Mayan society was not very well structured in terms of its government. It was sort of like a loose confederation of city-states, and eventually did decline and died out. But the most important Mesoamerican culture for us are the Aztec, and the Aztec are the Mesoamerican civilization and the Mesoamerican society that exist in the crucial year 1492, because 1492 is the year when people from the Old World, Christopher Columbus, visited or came to the New and led to the ending of that isolation which had occurred between New World and Old World. The Aztec had built a massive city at Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico. It was built in the middle of a lake, Lake Texcoco. Here you have an illustration of that. You could see Tenochtitlan right in the middle there, and it's surrounded by a lake. This was useful for two reasons. One was that it served as a natural kind of barrier to any outside invaders, and the Aztecs had made many enemies of their neighbors, but also provided for very rich farmland. And the type of farmland or the type of farms that the Aztec grew were called chinapas, or floating gardens. And these were little islands that were created inside of the lake that provided the water that was necessary to grow food for that particular society. Tenochtitlan itself was, at the time, again, the Aztecs, roughly 1300 CE Common Era to 1500 CE, perhaps was the most populated city, not just in the New World, but perhaps in all of the world at the time. So it was a very sophisticated civilization. Key aspects about Aztec society in terms of social mobility. Social mobility is sort of how easy it is to rise and fall in a particular society. We might also refer to this as social order. Social order refers to the way that society is organized. And different cultures and different civilizations have different degrees of social mobility, your ability to rise and fall, or social order. That is to say, who is kind of given all the privileges in society and who is denied the privileges in society. In Aztec society, it was the warrior class and the priest class, which were of the utmost importance. Those who performed the best on the battlefield were typically the ones who lived in the largest houses, ate the most luxurious food, wore the most luxurious clothing. For women in Aztec society, it was if you were the mother of a great warrior, again, that was your way to social mobility, to rise to the top. The priest class was also very, very important. Religion played a central role in Aztec society, especially to ensure that crops and agriculture kept growing. And one aspect of that, and this was you could say perhaps inherited from earlier Mesoamerican societies, was the practice of ritual human sacrifice. And in doing so, what that meant in some cases was that the goal of Aztec warriors was not necessarily to kill their enemy, but rather to capture their enemy. And those enemies would then be captured and sacrificed on various altars to ensure that the crops and the food kept growing. So religion and warfare were very important to Aztec society. And as a consequence of that, meant that the Aztecs did not get along with their neighbors. They made very many enemies. So the Aztecs are the latest Mesoamerican or Middle America society in the crucial year of 1492. But they weren't the only sophisticated society at the time when Columbus arrived. You also had the civilization of the Inca. Now, the Inca, by comparison, let's scroll up. The Inca, by comparison, were not located in Mesoamerica, but were rather located in South America, modern-day Peru, in the Andes Mountains, so a different location geographically. And while the Inca, and the Aztec existed simultaneously, there's very little evidence to suggest that the two had any sort of comprehensive trade with one another. For the most part, the two civilizations kept to themselves, not a lot of trade going on between those two civilizations. But because this was a civilization that was located in South America, specifically the Andes Mountains, there were a few other different features to it. So, for example, the Inca did not practice human sacrifice. Nearly as much as their Aztec counterparts, There's a different culture there. They didn't inherit certain aspects of Mesoamerican society. What the Inca did really thrive at doing was their road system. And this was something that rivaled the Roman roads. And as you might imagine, because it's a very mountainous area geographically, it's difficult to get around. And so this road system was instrumental in terms of providing a way for the Inca to administer and to run their empire. In the Inca Empire, you had a lack of two, what we might consider to be basic technologies, but there was a reason for it. Inca had no wheeled vehicles, So no wheel and no riding system, This is also one of the differences between the Aztec and the Inca. The Aztecs had a riding system, which they inherited from predecessor Mesoamerican societies. The Inca had no riding system, and this suggests to us that, well, perhaps they didn't trade with the Aztecs as much or for as long, and so therefore did not adopt that technology, which was the case in the Old World. When you look at writing in Europe, Asia, and Africa, it's mostly technology spread through diffusion. That was not necessarily the case here. And no wheeled vehicles. So we're going to chalk this up to maybe lack of long distance and maybe sustained trade, because it turns out that writing is very difficult to invent. Most societies on the planet, practically all of them, adopted writing via learning it from someone else. No wheeled vehicles, right? Why not any wheels? Well, that was because mostly there was no large domesticated mammals, right? So not only in South America, but also in North America, there was no pigs, cows, ox, horse, right? Goats, sheep, right? All of these animals that you could potentially attach to a wheeled vehicle, none of these existed in the New World, right? And that was simply a matter of overhunting that occurred in the New World. In the New World, the people there had more or less hunted the large mammals into an extinction, whereas in the Old World, you did have all those animals available, and that provided an advantage, especially when it came to wheeled vehicles. So without a wheel and without a riding system, how did the Inca manage? Well, in terms of communication, the Inca had chasquis, or runners, and these were administrators who essentially ran by foot on this pristine road system around the empire in order to distribute orders and relay communication. In terms of record keeping and counting, although there was no writing system, the Inca did develop a system of counting called Kuipu. This is Kuipu right here. And what Kuipu allows you to do is that you have a series of ropes, and these ropes you tie knots in various areas, and that's a form of record keeping. So you could count, you could contain information. It was, it wasn't the same thing as a writing system, but it was a record keeping system. So tax collection and things like that, census information could be kept via Kuipu. So these were two different ways here that the Inca had administrated their system. In terms of the governing structure, the Aztecs had an emperor. The Inca had something very similar called the Great Inca. And in the Inca Empire, the Great Inca, or the ruler, owned all the land and was considered to be part deity. And so the Inca practiced mummification of their rulers, believing that even after the Great Inca dies, they can continue to rule even in the afterlife. And so this mummification practice was used. In terms of labor, the Inca used a mita labor system. So mita is a labor system, and this was a way for the Inca to collect taxes. Without wheeled vehicles, right, it's very difficult to, let's say, haul in a large quantity of agriculture. So rather what the Inca would do is they would recruit people from faraway distant villages. They would come to a temple or something like that. They would perform labor, and that labor service would essentially be a form of taxation, and then those people could essentially go back. So this was a way for the Inca to extract value from their empire, from their population, without having to carry large quantities of goods. It was simply just the people themselves. And the Inca themselves also very good at architecture. Machu Picchu, which is perhaps the most well-known relic of the Inca Empire. You see that imaged here. Very sophisticated in the way that it was built in the mountains, and was very much a structure that endured the test of time. And so both the Inca and the Aztecs, right, these are the two most sophisticated civilizations in the New World by the time of Columbus, and for Spanish conquest of the New World, most likely going to be their biggest obstacles, right? Their biggest obstacles. However, the Inca and the Aztecs, they're both in South America. So let's talk a little bit about North American Indians, right? People who lived in North America prior to the arrival of Columbus. By comparison, North American peoples were more diverse, more dispersed, and had less complex societies in terms of governing structures. you didn't really have overarching empires with massive armies, bureaucratic systems like the Aztec and the Inca. Those were really the two most sophisticated civilizations. And in North America, society revolved, the diverse way that North American people lived also had a lot to do with their environment. So depending on where in North America we're referring to, the people there lived different sort of lifestyles, had different languages, different cultures, etc., etc. So for example, in the Southwest, so if we want to look at this area here, if we look at the map, actually you guys can't see that. Let me scroll down a bit. If we're looking at the Southwest, so this is this area here, the environment there is very dry, it's arid, not a lot of plant life, not a lot of animal life there. And so the people there, the Pueblo, and the various other tribes that existed, you got the Anasazi, the Hohokam, and the Mogolin. The Pueblo lived in more permanent stone and mud buildings. This was due to livelihood essentially being based on farming, right? So the Pueblo in the Southwest almost exclusively surviving via farming because there's not much else that the environment can essentially provide. Because of that, because those societies were incredibly sedentary, structures in which they lived in, again, were made out of stone, pottery, and other crafts because you allow for the accumulation of goods with sedentary societies. And of course, irrigation was very, very important there, right? So you can kind of get a feel for how some of the people lived in that particular region. Now, if we look to a different area like the Ohio Valley, which is essentially this area, kind of right in here a little bit, there it was a little bit different. It was not exclusively an existence of farming. It was farming with hunting and with gathering as a combination of things. Structures or the types of homes that people lived in were less permanent. They weren't made necessarily out of stone or mud, but rather a combination of branches, trees, other things that existed in that particular region. And then you had groups who lived along the Mississippi River, which is roughly this region here. And there we find what is perhaps the closest thing to what might be the most sophisticated civilization in North America, and that is the city of Cahokia. Cahokia thrived roughly 1200 CE. So this was a major urban center that sat on the Mississippi River, essentially was a central location for trade that occurred in North America. And Cahokia, by the time that Columbus arrives, has essentially already declined. It's no longer present, achieving its high point roughly 300 years before Christopher Columbus arrived there. Lastly, we could talk about the people who lived in the eastern woodlands. Here we might be referring to this particular region here. We might also include the Powhatan with them as well. It's getting a little bit messy on this map here, but the eastern woodlands, this particular region right here. There you had a much more densely congregated group of people living there. And so one of the characteristics of people who lived in the eastern woodlands prior to Columbus arriving was more common warfare between tribes. And generally speaking, people were organized into clan or tribal units. We might also use the term kin group. Kin refers to family. And in charge of each of these groups was a tribal chief. Now, some of these societies varied, so we can't really paint them with too broad of a brush, because the Algonquian, the Huron, the Iroquois, the Chippewa, there were certain differences within each of these societies and clans and tribes and groups. But we want to try and just summarize essentially some of the belief systems there. And generally speaking, these clan units, these tribal units were more or less the rule. Warfare was more common, so you were more likely to find things like confederations and alliances. In some of these societies, you had what we call matriarchy. That is the ability for women to have political power in some of these organizations. And for the most part, we could say that this was not just true of the Native Americans who lived in the eastern woodlands, but this was also true for many societies and many peoples in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. And that was the idea of private property. This was not held by most Native Americans. That land was not something to be purchased. It was not currency. And this idea of private property is going to run really right up against Europeans' belief of land and cause a lot of problems later on.